I will talk about an idea to improve the quality of the studies that we perform, which is based on methodological review boards. Now we have ethical review boards that check ethical aspects of studies that we perform. The idea is simple. Methodological review boards could exist to perform similar checks, but of methodological aspects of the studies that we perform. And currently, our main source of quality control is actually the peer review process. So we perform our studies, we submit them to a scientific journal. When we are done with all the research that we've done, we've written it up, then we send it off, and the peer experts will tell us whether we did a good job or not, or whether they think we did a good job or not. And there's something peculiar about this, because we basically wait until everything is done before we ask peers to criticize what we've done. And of course, at this moment, it's a little bit too late to change anything about our study. We can do another study. We can try to discuss limitations of our study, but we can't really go back in time and fix it. So it's kind of peculiar that we wait with inviting scientific criticism all the way to the end. Now, this wouldn't be so much of a problem if every paper that we read is perfect. And that's something that we maybe hope is the case, but often it's not the case. So scientific work is, sometimes of very high quality, but if you read it and you have some methodological expertise, it's not too difficult to find sort of mistakes or things that could have been improved if you read the literature. So in essence, what we have is that somewhere between very high quality and very low quality, these papers fall on average. And sometimes it's really problematic. And even though I don't like something like publication bias, where certain papers never are published, I have to admit that sometimes I review a paper and I say, well, I don't really know what we're going to learn if you even share this. So sometimes in peer review process, I'm reviewer too, as they say, and I suggest that a paper should be rejected. Now, that's, of course, a sad thing for everybody involved. I don't really like recommending to reject a paper, but I'm pretty sure the people on the other side also don't like it. So, yeah, it's kind of weird that we wait until the end to try to criticize papers. Now, what you can do is try to move this process of criticism forward in time up to a point where you can still change something about it. And this would prevent research waste. So if these studies are performed, we can't do anything to fix them. We're basically left with low quality studies that we might not feel are worth sharing. But if we would move this process forward, then we can save some of these studies and basically do science more efficiently. There are a couple of possibilities. I wanted to discuss 4, but I cut one. So I'll discuss 3 ways that we can do this. And they all share this main characteristic of moving the criticism forward. I'll start with methodological review and talk most about this, but I briefly want to mention these 2 other ways that we can do this. Red teams and peer community in registered reports. So I'll talk about these, but mainly about methodological review. Now, if I start to talk to people about methodological review boards, typically I hear 2 responses. One is, it would never work. Nice try, but this would be a disaster if you would try to implement it in practice. The other response that I hear is, what's new about this? We've been doing something like this for many years. It just makes perfect sense. So that's interesting, and both can be true, right? It could be that in some specific fields or locations or even institutions, this is never going to work, but that in other places or fields or institutions, this works perfectly. So there can be some moderators about when and where we should implement this. I should also be honest that sometimes there's a third response, which is something along the lines of, you fascist, you're trying to take away all my scientific freedom. This can also be true, but even then it can still be a good idea to have a methodological review board. So whether you're enthusiastic about this idea depends on a couple of characteristics. Not everybody will like it, but some people might be tempted to like it, and it depends on a couple of factors. So first of all, you might think, why would we have a board for this? That's institutionalizing something, increasing bureaucracy, red tape. If people want to find help, they will go and look for an expert if they need one. So if you think that researchers who need this the most will also volunteer for it, without requiring them to go through a step where somebody checks their methods in any way, then you're probably less enthusiastic about methodological review boards. But if you think that there are some people who would actually benefit a lot from having a methodological expert look over their study before they perform it, then you might be more enthusiastic about it. A second is you might think, should we really need to do this for all studies that we perform? Because, there are some people who honestly think that most of the studies we do are kind of, worthless anyway. Maybe real skeptics. And there are only a couple of studies that matter. So if you get everybody to go through this process, there's a lot of studies that are just fluff or don't have any value. So you shouldn't do it for all studies. We can discuss for which kind of studies you want to have methodological review. You don't have to do it for all. Another thing where people differ on is, do you prefer top-down regulation, or would you like it if people self-organize? And I think probably academics in general are not too much of a fan of top-down regulation. I think sometimes it can have its benefits, and I don't really see a process like this self-organized, but that's another thing you might want to consider, depending on whether you're enthusiastic for a methodological review board or not. And there's a last thing, and maybe you think my research is perfect. It's exactly good, and there's nothing that you can improve about it, so don't let other people say what they think I should do, because I know best. So if you think others can't improve your research, then you're also not so excited about this, but maybe you think, okay, it's possible. Now, I don't want to, divide who belongs into which category, but in my experience, younger researchers, maybe people who are just starting, or even PhD students, are often, kind of like, oh, somebody's going to help me design a better study. That doesn't feel too bad. Anyway, you can think of where you are on this spectrum, and maybe where your colleagues would be, whether they would be excited for this. Now, the main thing that a methodological review board is that it's an internal committee. That level of a department, you want this to be people who understand your methods, of course, right? I mean, I work at a technical university in Eindhoven. I do research on psychology, that's my background. I don't want a chemist to look through my methods. So you have to keep this close, where people have experience and expertise on the methods that are used. And what they do is they evaluate proposals, for example, based on certain checklists or properties that they would like to see discussed before a study is performed. And there are actually many checklists out there. So if you do research, it doesn't really matter what field you are, if you look around, you'll see that very often there are certain checklists that have been developed because there are things people need to think about before they do their studies, but they often don't think about these studies. People forget them, or maybe they intentionally don't do it because it's kind of effortful. So these checklists try to prevent this. There's an example here, that's the SPIRIT checklist, which is developed for interventional trials. And I'll discuss this a little bit on the next slides, because this has been evaluated to some extent. So this is a checklist, but could work in other fields, and then you would have other kind of checklists. Now, it turns out that even if we have these checklists, many people don't really follow them. So the idea is that people will report certain things and think about things in advance. We make a checklist for it, but then people actually also forget to check the checklists. So this doesn't seem to work. And I already mentioned that this SPIRIT checklist, which is used in the journal Trials, it asks about certain properties of methods. So you might also think, what should a methodological review board check? Well, these are some things that would be on the SPIRIT checklist that would make sense to check by methodological experts before a study is performed. It involves things like sample size justification, the planned analysis, if people think about how they'll deal with missing data, the exclusion criteria for participants, and also some discussions about measures that are used, maybe asking people to consider the reliability and validity of measures, and things like interim analysis, for example. So all these things, there's many more, but there are things on a checklist. And again, what would be on this checklist depends on the field that you work at. So at this journal, Trials, they have protocol editors that check the checklists. And yes, there is a certain level of bureaucracy here at play. So we're really trying to make people do the right thing. We create a checklist, but then we also need people to check whether people actually do the checklists. And it's interesting to see, because it's very difficult to get people to do the right thing by themselves, apparently. So they introduced this SPIRIT guidelines in 2013, and then 6 years later, somewhere 2019, they started to evaluate what happened over the years, and they write, after 6 years, not even 2/3 of all items are adequately reported, and the investigators found no protocols among the 150 from 2019 that addressed all items. So it seems people are not doing at least a perfect job, and often not even a very good job. Now, again, they also note the fact that because many times trials have even already started the moment that the trials or the proposals are sent to this specific journal, to trials, they can't really do anything about the weaknesses they see. So they write, most trials submitting a protocol for publication in trials are already underway, restricting us from commenting on potential design problems. So you can feel some frustration here, and I felt this frustration. I'm the chair of the ethical review board at my university, and I feel this sometimes. I see studies, sometimes really big, really expensive studies. We are supposed to only look at the ethical aspects, and we check those off, and those are fine. But then you see glaring methodological issues that could be fixed, but you're not supposed to comment on it. So that's basically one of the reasons why I thought, why don't we also consider having a methodological review board? So my own field is psychology. We also have the kind of checklists, the JARS, Journal Article Reporting Standards, very sensible guidelines. It would be good if they're used more, but people rarely use them. So what the ideas that I propose is that people, that these methodological review boards focus on whether a research design can answer the question that the researcher is asking. Now that seems like a very low bar, but of course it means that they have to collect enough information, like participants, for example. They have to have a good, solid statistical analysis and all those kind of things. So even this low bar already leads to situations where you would suggest people to implement certain improvements. And this is not just smart to try to design a study that can answer your research question, but it's also a research integrity issue. So the Code of Conduct of Research Integrity in the Netherlands has this item, number 5, make sure that your research design can answer the research question. Again, it might sound silly, but it's in there because it turns out that sometimes we just waste studies that we collect because even this low bar is not met. Now, although I really enjoy going on Twitter when I'm bored to fight with some Bayesians about whether frequentist statistics is better than Bayesian statistics, that is not the kind of discussion that I'm talking about what these review boards are supposed to do. So they want to see whether people can answer the question they're asking. So whatever kind of approach you want, whatever the answer is that you want to get from your data, they should look at, are the choices coherent? Whatever your philosophy in the statistics you choose to use, and are all aspects of your design well justified? Now, there are, of course, some more controversial topics that could come up. And one of these is whether a methodological review board should look at the validity of measures. Now, personally, I would say that would be nice. In an ideal world, yes, we want this. But if you'd ask me about my own field, I think maybe currently we're not really at a place where our measures are good enough. So if you would start to do this, a lot of people would be in problems and they couldn't do much about it themselves. So some of these things you might want to not do at the moment. Of course, these are all things open for discussions, right? So we really just want to have a situation where we check if people can answer the question they're asking, and whatever you feel is necessary to do this is something that these boards could do. You don't have to do this for all studies, and definitely if you want to start, you have to start somewhere. I wouldn't start with every study that the university does. So you could think about starting with studies that are especially costly, because if those are badly designed, there's a lot of waste in one single study. You could also think about sensitive populations. So if we collect data from certain groups, we really want that to be a well-designed study. You can also think of how you want to implement a board like this. Do you want to make it required, or do you want to offer it as a service so that maybe people who feel slightly insecure about their study design will go and ask these people for help? Or do you think that there are people who think that they're doing a great study, but you know they're not, and you also want to force these people to go there? An important one is this methodological review board cooperative or some sort of unpersonal entity that only communicates through emails and says reject and nothing else? I wouldn't recommend it. The way that I would see this work best is if there's a very cooperative methodological review board that doesn't just tell you what you did wrong, but also how you can improve this in the future, or even for this specific study. The main thing that should happen is that we have a methodological review board where people feel that it adds value, right? So that the costs, basically, of this procedure, because it is extra work, I understand, has enough benefits so that the studies that we do also improve. So this is a necessity. And I would also say that we should study this. So this is a proposal, right? I'm proposing to do this. Some places have implemented it, but what you should do continuously is evaluate whether people see some benefit here. Even researchers themselves should be positive about this, in the sense that if these methodological review boards do a good job, researchers should experience that the studies they submit are accepted faster or at better journals because they have actually designed better studies with less flaws, and also that they find more informative results. If this is all not the case and people are like, look, thank you for going through this extra hoop, but I'm not getting anything from it, then maybe you're not doing a good enough job, and methodological review boards should be abandoned. So what are some of the benefits additional to designing better studies? I think one other thing that I like about having a methodological review board at a university is that it promotes specialization. Currently, many fields like mine, we ask single researchers to do everything. They have to be excellent theoreticians, programmers, writers, but also methodologists. If you have a methodological review board, especially a cooperative one that will help people improve their studies, then basically it creates a career trajectory for people that have methodological expertise. Departments will often not hire a person just to help other people do better research, even if this would be extremely valuable and worth the money. Instead, what you see is that people often hire somebody who does research themselves. Right? So we don't hire people in these supportive roles. We don't hire specialists to help other people. But I like that this creates career possibilities for people who would want to do this. So we've done this in my own department. We have been doing sort of methodological checks for around 4 years. In my experience, of course, sometimes this is seen as a hassle, especially in the beginning, because you force people to learn certain things. Learning how to justify your sample size in a good way takes time for people, and using heuristics doesn't take a lot of time. So of course people feel this is a bit of extra work. It might be that they're not completely honest if I ask them, but then again, I'm Dutch and we have a lot of Dutch directness, so I think they would tell me if they feel otherwise. But in general, I think there's some agreement that it raises the quality of studies after a while. People don't really seem to complain after they've learned how to design better studies themselves, and they do appreciate it. It's a good way to train staff, because many times people just keep doing what they've learned in the 80s, and we don't really get better research practices. But methodological review boards can look at the state of the art, which often is something that actually was invented in the 70s, but people just never adopted. And they can say, look, we really start to expect that you improve certain things about your methods. Things that we've done in our department are, for example, always plan for the absence of an effect and make sure that you design a study that cannot just reject the null hypothesis, but also conclude that whatever effect is there is too small to matter. But also the introduction of things like sequential analysis, which are very efficient, but people didn't do in our department. So I would say that these methodological review boards deserve a shot in some places. They deserve to be studied and implemented in some places. We should try it out. And there are people who are looking at this. It is being studied. Again, there are places where they are already implemented. So I think it's worth experimenting with this more. In some fields, this is much more common than in other fields. As I mentioned, some people think it can never work and it impacts scientific freedom. Those things are very similar to what you see when you have ethical review boards. Same kind of issues play a role there. There are two other solutions that I just briefly want to mention, because we can do methodological review boards. It's one idea to have this criticism moved, not after all the data is in the papers written, but to the front before you collect your data. Another approach we've played around with is using red teams. And red teams, the idea is you have a blue team and a red team. The blue team are the researchers. The red team is basically a set of people who's trying to criticize the project as it's going on. It's a term that comes from software development, where one group will basically create software and the other group will try to hack it or break it in some way. And they do this to increase the quality of the product before it goes public. So in science, if we do this, the idea is that you enlist experts who already help you. Basically, expert peers who criticize the study that you're doing continuously throughout the research project from the start. The idea is, again, that you improve the quality of your study, you move the criticism forward, and we've experimented a bit with this where we pay these people to play this role. We did this, for example, in a couple of projects, but one which is almost ready, hopefully, to be published, where people studied gender discrimination and whether gender discrimination declined over time. It used to be strong in the past, but maybe it's declined and is maybe now not so big an issue anymore. Now, you can imagine that this is a very sensitive topic. People will have opinions about this. You don't want to get this wrong. So what these people wanted is to make sure that the study was of the highest possible quality, so that every choice they made was criticized by some people, so that they incorporated all kinds of things from the start. So we helped them out here by getting 4 experts in different aspects of what they were doing. This was a systematic review, so we had librarians, we had methodologists, all those kind of things. But also, for example, something they didn't think of themselves to add, but what we call sort of a wild card, somebody that you might think, what would they know about a quantitative project like this? But we invited a qualitative gender researcher to give feedback on it. So there were, in this example, some rounds of reviews beforehand. These reviewers, we paid them certain amounts of money for these reviews. And the idea is here that you really have this cooperative, collaborative atmosphere. Even though you're criticizing people, you know that you're doing this with the goal to get this project to the highest possible level. So this is one other approach, these kind of red teams, right? We described it briefly. Over this briefly describes what we did. So with these experts that we got in this case were on statistics, meta-analysis, gender research, so the content topic, also a librarian for these systematic reviews, which I think people often forget that they can enlist the help of librarians, even if they should, and got these people to give improvements. And sort of how this works is that you have a systematic list on the left here of all sorts of comments that these experts gave. And on the right, the way that the blue team, the researchers, tried to improve their study, again, before they actually went out and do it, to reach, hopefully, the highest possible quality here. So I also have some experiences here that I'd like to share. So you get very high quality feedback, of course, because you ask some of the top experts in the field, not just in your department, but really the best people in the world for this. So you get high quality feedback from the start. Certain things that would definitely have turned out to be limitations or maybe even mistakes in a project like this were improved at the start when it was still possible. But this is a lot of work. Methodological review takes checklists and goes through certain aspects. This is much more work than that. So it's not for everybody, but the people here found it sort of worthwhile in this process. Then there's a last thing I briefly want to mention. This is in general registered reports, but specifically peer community in registered reports. So this is a platform of researchers who have organized, self-organized. So this is not top-down regulation. This is bottom-up regulation or bottom-up organization. These people have self-organized as journal reviewers, detached from any specific journal. You can basically enlist the help of these reviewers before you plan your study if you want to do a registered report. So a registered report is where your research proposal, the introduction, and the methods are reviewed before you do the data collection. You get all the feedback, again, before you actually do the study, while you can still improve it. So that's the idea of these registered reports. And then what they also do is they say, look, if you follow the plan as is explained here, so what you wanted to do based on after you've incorporated the feedback of these peers, of the peer community in platform, then there are also certain journals that will accept this for publication if you just follow the plan as it was proposed. So that's the idea of registered reports. basically check everything in advance. You get some criticism, you improve the study, and then you collect the data and you can publish it. So there are a couple of journals that commit to publishing these kind of reviews by this peer community, right? It's, again, not attached to any specific journal. It's self-organized, but the people of a couple of journals say, well, we trust those people to have high quality peer review. So if they say it's good enough, this registered report, we will be happy to just publish it. So that's another interesting initiative. I've also submitted there, and I'm editing for peer community. And I think this has many benefits to traditional peer review. Let's start there. Again, many younger people are kind of happy to get the criticism of experts before they actually do their study, so they can still improve it. It's also a kind of strong thing to detach the peer review process from journals. I think this is something that in the future of science we would really like to have. So I think it's a major strength. In my experience as a researcher who submits to a journal like this or to the peer community I thought the quality of the feedback was extremely high. Definitely some of the best reviews that I've gotten. And they also have certain nice components, which is scheduled peer review. So if you say, hey, I will send you my manuscript 3 weeks from now, they already start searching for reviewers and schedule in, okay, you have 2 weeks, like a couple of weeks from now, block 2 weeks somewhere or a day in these 2 weeks. So you get quite fast turnaround. So a very interesting solution as well. Now, all these three things do the same thing. They move scientific criticism forward to a point where you can still do something about it. Again, the main focus here was methodological review boards. I think you can organize this within your department. There's a lot of benefits to do this, especially if you like people to maybe not voluntarily go for these things, which happens with peer community for example, and the red team approach. But if you say, no, there are some people who need this, but they don't want to do it by themselves, we're going to make them go to a methodological review board. Might not make you friends, but it might make science better. What they also do is they try to reward getting criticism, because you can still improve things, right? But also by, for example, paying the peers who drew the criticism, or by creating career paths for methodological experts. And finally, they all try to make transparent how rigorously a study has been vetted. So you can say, look, our study has been reviewed by this methodological review board. You can say we had a red team, or this was a registered report by peer community. So it's more transparent how it's been evaluated. Often in the normal peer review process, it's still closed in many of the instances. All right, that's the talk. Thank you for listening so far. Just as a final kind of advertisement, if you like to think about making science better, we have a podcast where we also talk about these things. So a little bit of advertisement at the end if you want to listen. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Super interesting. I do have a lot of questions, but I want to open the floor for others. Please raise your hand to ask a question. And we do have comments and questions in the chat. So would very much appreciate if those people, unless you have problems accessing the microphone, if you could raise your hand to actually ask your question. So Julia Bidon, you had a question, but I'm not sure what it refers to. What has to be anonymous. So if you could rephrase your question one more time. So David, please go ahead, and we'll look into the chat questions in a moment.
Hello.
Hey.
I guess that this is going to be terribly field dependent. And that means that some people will have to go through it and some people would not. I mean, in my erstwhile field of single ion channel kinetics, there are about 6 people in the entire world doing it seriously, and only 3 of those were major competition. And if they've got to review every single channel study in the world, that's going to be impossible to arrange.
Yeah. No, it's definitely not possible for all fields, I think. So it really depends. And I agree. So it's very field dependent. And I try to say, look, there are a couple of factors where you can think, is it possible or not? But definitely like the resources in a field, like are there enough people who are able to do this? Is the expertise even there? For example, those are important questions. But the Spirit checklist and the trials journal who's doing these kind of checks, yeah, I think that's a good example of a field where it does work. So in these interventional trials, it seems that there's enough similarity in the kind of studies that are being developed that there are enough people who can do it. So yeah, maybe not fit for all places. And maybe if there are only 6 people doing good science, doing specific science, you actually have a similar issue in, for example, high particle physics. Everybody
Exactly,
who
yes.
does this works at CERN. So who else is there left to review it? And what you see there is that they build these internal criticisms. So there, this kind of red team approach seems to be maybe a little bit of a better fit, for example. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. So I'd like to ask Emma's question in the chat. So she says that I acknowledge that the registered reports aren't necessarily suitable for all research, but when considering efficiency of resources within the whole research system, they may be more efficient than the separate review board because pre-study review of methods and peer review happen simultaneously. What do you see as the benefit of a review board above the pre-study review of registered reports?
Yeah, this comes down, I think, to where you fall on this line of, do you like top-down regulation or do you like bottom-up things where people improve? And one of the benefits of having departmental methodological review is that there's somebody in charge who can say, you all have to do this. So I think Emma is a fan of registered reports. But how many people do registered reports? From all studies that are published in Science, how many are registered reports? It's a very tiny number. So there are people who are doing this, volunteering to do this, they want it. But there is a whole bunch of studies that will never be registered reports, probably. And yeah, if you're willing to make yourself a little bit less liked by some of your colleagues by forcing them to go through a methodological review board, then everybody would go through this, just like everybody goes through an ethical review board. So while I agree that I think if you would replace all studies with registered reports, there are good benefits. Again, as you say, might not be good for every study, but definitely for the studies where it's a fit, maybe you would want everything to be a registered report and not a methodological review. Completely agree. But I think there will be decades or maybe centuries before that happens. So in the meantime, a methodological review board can prevent some research waste. So that would be my main argument for also trying out that route for the other studies, basically. Yeah.
Thank you, Daniel. I have a question about organization of this particular approach. So you gave an example of how this could be organized in the university, and the great if some universities take this proactive approach. My question is, how would you see this organized for national funders? So, because I think this might be a bit more efficient. Let's say there are couple top national funders in the country, and they are responsible. They can pretty much assure quality of the research coming out of that country. So, and then my next question connected to that is, how much would that cost? And should that be the third party? So what is your thinking about this national approach?
I love the idea. I mean, I think it's good. I didn't consider it myself so much, but it makes a lot of sense. So there you would again limit the studies that fall under this. And now they're funded studies, right? And in my field of psychology, where we sometimes can get studies done, with, I mean, some of my colleagues do psychophysics research, things with auditory processing or visual processing, and they do it on themselves and maybe one random PhD student they drag in from the corridor. So they don't really need funding, they just can do this themselves. So one thing is, if you do it through the funding route, then it's only for studies that are funded. But for those studies, it makes a lot of sense for a funder to say, look, wait, we have some people here, or we find some people for you who will do these kind of methodological checks before you go and do your studies, because we are paying you to do this. And again, they might do it for very expensive studies above a certain number of, cost, for example. But I think then you're doing quality control, reasonable quality control, because you're also funding these studies, and you can help organize it, and you have some power over these people because you're also giving them this money. So if you incorporate it on that side, I think that is extremely interesting to do. right? So organizing it through funders would be a good mechanism. Might be a bit more difficult to find people who have the expertise, right? That might be a big cost. I don't know how it work out. In a department, people can typically evaluate studies of other department members. That's also not always true. And again, if that's not true, you can't do a methodological review board. But in many cases, I think it is true. Might be more effortful for a funder. But otherwise, I think it's a great idea. I sort of wonder sometimes. I mean, I just completed a 5-year grant where they gave me 800,000 euros. And nobody looked at what I've done for this. I mean, I could just spend it. They trusted me completely, which is lovely. But maybe, you want to have some quality control checks for this kind of money that you're giving me. So I wouldn't think it's a weird thing to try out. Yeah.
All right, thank you. So we have another question in the chat from Luke Alanis. Is there a movement to encourage registered reports to be used as default rather than exception practices? And is your feeling that journals in general may not be too interested in promoting registered reports, perhaps because this would involve a smaller number of studies being published overall?
And then the smaller number of studies being published because many people would not do these studies, or because sometimes people do 4 study papers, but a registered report would just be for 1. I don't know what they mean, but let me try to catch both of these things. So in my experience, registered reports are new, and for many scientists, anything that's new, they don't really know how to do it. So editors have a bit of a harder time getting these things started up. So that might be a hesitance to introduce them. I actually know a lot of journals that are enthusiastic about them, but then they also don't get enough submissions of the people in their field for these kind of registered reports. So there's a little bit on both sides, some hesitance to actually do this. Would it make sense to use this as a default? It's an interesting question. It's a very interesting question, and I don't know. I feel that if you look at how people respond to having some colleagues do certain checklist checks, if you see how people respond to this about whether they have to give up some of their freedom, and then you want to propose, and if Luca wants to do this, by all means, if Luca wants to be the person who says, actually, I don't even think we just have methodological review boards, I think everybody should be forced to do registered reports, I think people will have an even harder time accepting this. So I think that's mainly the hesitance on this side, where people feel a bit difficult to require people to do this. I also think that the format itself from registered reports has really improved over time, and this peer community in system, where you can schedule these reviews so that you don't have to wait, that is really kind of a game changer in my view, because one of the things that was problematic is if you want to do your study, you had to submit your registered report proposal, submit it, wait maybe weeks, maybe months until you get it back, and only then could you progress with data collection. And people found this break kind of difficult to plan in, especially for PhD thesis or stuff like this. So I also think the format itself has been improved. So and about whether it leads to a smaller number of studies published, I don't know. Not necessarily. And there is also papers where you can register a study and then go back and register the second study and have multiple study papers. So I don't know if that's an answer, I hope.
Thank you. So my next question to you is about resources. Because once again, perhaps you have a brilliant department. Many experiences I've heard of or experienced myself is people are overworked, busy. There's so many requirements for academics and pressures. Carving out time for this. And I mean, it's possible if it's properly organized and budgeted from scratch, but just going to the department and say, why don't you guys do it? It's, I just have a hard time imagining that. So, and that leads me to the next question. There's a lot of debate in terms of peer review and whether we should be paying reviewers. And this is such an ungrateful job and it takes so much of my academic time. And obviously, quality of peer review varies tremendously. There are exceptional peer reviewers who spend a lot of time and provide constructive, very important points. And there are a lot of reviews which come back to you. You realize a person either didn't read the paper or spent, 15 minutes on it saying, great paper. So there's
exactly.
a comma on page 3. Why don't you enter that? So Is there a risk something like this may happen with methodological reviews? And sorry, I'm pushing too many questions. And whether these methodological reviews should be in the public domain. You know, some journals say, hey, here are all the peer review comments, read them. So you have a whole basket of questions now to deal with, so please go ahead.
I'll go backwards. So the last thing, like, should this be in the public domain? There was actually a comment published I wrote a commentary on this, a worldview piece for Nature, where I propose these methodological review boards, or I say we should experiment with them. And there was one comment published where they said, well, that's very nice, but then if you have these methodological reviews, you should, like boards, you should make this process transparent. You should publish it as an appendix. Because we need to be able to see how good this quality is. And I kind of agree with this. I actually think that you should, maybe publish the ethical review board decisions as well, because I don't know, I mean, we spend a lot of time carefully thinking about it. Why not? So that, I think, in terms of transparency, is a good idea. But your biggest question is the workload that this costs. And that's an important one. And this would be a complete disaster if you would tell people, look, you're working here on this level. We've seen some of these checklists and best practices, and they're actually here. And that's what's going to happen, right? Sometimes, at least for some people, that's going to happen. And then you say, you know what you're supposed to do? You have to wait 2 years, study these 27 papers, learn about all these things. Now you've become a better researcher, and now you can come back to us. That's not going to make any friends, and maybe also not worth it. But what you see is that there's a little bit of a co-evolution, actually, both of the methodological review board and of the researchers. So if you're on a board like this, you should like to learn a little bit more about new things over time, because you get proposals, you get things, you're like, oh, wait, I don't really know what this is. So what I see in our department, how it went, is that people think, but wait, what are we supposed to do about this? Let me read a little bit about this. And they dive into some topics and they educate themselves. The board educates themselves. And then they also educate the people who submit these proposals. And then very slowly, this rises over time. So you shouldn't do everything at once. And to give you a concrete example, in the beginning in our department, we said, you should probably say something about your sample size. Just state it. And then 6 months later, we said, okay, so you've learned how to state your sample size. But we actually mean you have to say something about where you got this sample size. And then people said, well, I don't know, I opened a power analysis software and I clicked OK, and then it gave me the number 64, and that's why I'm doing 64. And we said, fine, great. And then 6 months later we said, well, but you're actually supposed to do this. So very slowly, right, you make people learn about new things. So the time that it takes, if you build the expertise over time, I mean, then at least this part of learning doesn't take a lot of time. You always have people that need to go through all these things. But what you also see, that's, I think, a strength of doing it within a department. After a while, you're like, here is David again with his new study. But we've already seen the previous 7 studies of David, and he does the same thing a lot of the time. And there's a variation here, but everything's fine again. We know that this is a good study, check. So it starts to become less time. The first couple of times, it's a lot of time. But over time, you're like, here they are again. We know how they work. You're right, because you're very close to the researchers. And that's the benefit of this more cooperative model. It's still more time, but maybe not as much as people would think. I don't know.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat from Zainab. So, can a study published with pre-registration be comparable to a well-designed study that is not pre-registered?
Yes, completely. And even the opposite, right? It can be that a pre-registered study is worse than a study that is not pre-registered. That's, of course, not the goal, but that can totally be the case because, I mean, even if you adequately check methodological aspects, you can have a theoretically weak study. Or if we don't check the measures, you can have a study that, statistically everything is perfect, but the measures are completely not valid. So there are all sorts of things that can go wrong. It's even possible that people pre-register a very bad analysis. That happens, right? And then, so I don't think you can by default say one is better than the other. They can be equally good. But what you want to do is create a procedure that if we work like this, on average, the quality will be higher. And I think that it's much more difficult to say that if we carefully check and let experts give criticism on a study, either in a methodological review setting or in a registered report setting, it's very difficult to argue that this makes studies worse in the long run. And if that is the case, you should definitely fire your methodological review. But there will be single exceptions, right? There will be a couple of people who said, oh man, this review board told me to do this naively. I just adopted what they said, but now I have a problem. That will happen, no doubt, but you hope that this procedure works better than the current way of working. And that's the hope. And we should evaluate if that's the case, of course. Just to say, yeah, we scrolled over a comment by Cruz, but I don't know. It sounds nice that people were revolting for a protocol review committee, but the nature piece helped. So I just want to say that it's nice to hear. Thank you. That's not a question, but it's a nice comment.
Yes, chat. Thank you for the comment, and thank you for your Nature article. That's how we found you, so it makes sense. I have another question, which might not be an easy one. So I think you brought a brilliant example of software developers where they check themselves. Mm-hmm. That practice, especially in a commercial company, makes a lot of sense, because should they not do it, the market will check them, and the investors will not forgive them. And there's very different stake at place. So if we look at research, chances that poor quality design is actually found, and I'm not talking about fraud here, I'm just saying there's things that should have been done better, very slim, just because peer review might not pick it up. Peer review is a bit too late. Then when they say, okay, I mean, they already done the study, what are they going to do? They didn't recruit the right number of patients, but what do we do at this stage? So peer review is way too late. Peer review might be of how well you put things into a transcript. That's too late to critique the study design. So my critical question about this, how much is this capture doing it within the department? Because let's not forget, department's objective, at least in the UK, I don't know how it's in the Netherlands or in the US, is to be ranked by a number of proper publications and high publications. So that's the key objective. You need to get research out there to the top journals. And like you said, if your methodological review guaranteed you the publication in New England Journal of Medicine or BMJ or name it in your field, that's one kind of scenario. Then this model works. If there is not this critical link, are you doing yourself a service or disservice? So what is the point where this might become corrupted?
So I think it's a good point that, people want to get published. It depends. I actually work in a department where I think people just want to do good research a lot of the time. People also want to get published, but there's culture differences between departments, I guess, a bit. But people want to get published. And we recently did a small study of, we're completing it now, but of pre-registered studies. So there's an online study registry, the Open Science Framework. People can go there to register a study. And that's an attempt of people to do a good, study. They want to say in advance, this is how we designed the study and everything. Now, there's a fun fact about this Open Science Framework and registrations on there, which is that after 4 years, the registration becomes public. So it's a private registry if you start, and for 4 years, everything is private. But after 4 years, we're able to see your registration. So what we did is we went into all these registrations that have become public 4 years ago, or after 4 years. So studies registered before, in our case, 2017. And we followed up, are these studies actually published? And then we asked people, why are they not published? And one important reason that they're not published is because the results were not informative enough. They found no results, but no results that they could not publish. And I think if you design a study well, it should be publishable. You have informative null results. Or the peer reviewers had some criticism. There was a flaw in the design. I mean, there were also people who just didn't have time to write things up. There are many other reasons why things are not published. But I believe there is a category of findings that is not published because people didn't manage to do it. So what you need to do is increase that enough so that the cost of the methodological review is smaller than the benefit of getting all those extra studies published. And then people might like it. Whether that's the case and whether we can manage, I'm not sure, right? I mean, we should see. But that is at least the goal. That should be the target. Yeah. What was the first part of your question? If you remind me, I'll...
No, just the fact that it might be corrupted because of the incentives. So I think you try to answer that, and it's a very, very complicated question and issue. And at the moment, it's the best way forward so far, because thinking this being organized by third party transparently and having resources covered for it is very difficult to hope for this.
Yeah, I think so. So, I mean, we have to do it with the resources we have. So, yeah, I agree.
Actually, can I ask you one clarification question? Because depends on all studies are different. There are some very time sensitive studies, and others which, if it starts in July, if it starts in November, it doesn't really matter. So it depends on the subject. How long does this take? Like, how much is the delay?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm also the chair of the ethical review board, and we folded into the ethical review board proposal. So we do both. You don't have to do it. You can have a separate board. But in our university ethics review, if it is not a very peculiar study, so not anything we haven't seen before, but if it's common methods, the turnaround time is ridiculously short. So people typically would get an ethical review board decision within a week. And we've organized it like this because we think we shouldn't have too much of a, it's already an effortful process, but it shouldn't delay people. So these people are actually working quite hard. We have a lot of people who care about ethics, but they also care about helping researchers do research quickly and efficiently. So yeah, there are scheduled meetings every week in some departments or every other week in other departments. And then if you submit before the deadline, you basically get a response sort of, within a week. Also of these methodological review boards. Now, so that means that some people have to have weekly meetings to do this, right? Every week. And that is effort, of course. So yeah, but it is fast.
Thank you. Very impressive. So David, please go ahead with your question.
Yeah. First of all, Lisa, you said that the ranking of departments depended on numbers of papers published. No, no one could be more dubious about the research excellence framework than me. But one thing they did get right was to say you can submit 4 papers. I think that was regardless of the size of the group as well. And 4 papers over 4 years is really quite small, and that's a strong disincentive to spaghetti slicing. That was a really good aspect of it, I thought. But now for Daniel, really the people who referee the grants should be doing this, surely, and that would speed things up. Of course, they often don't, but it could be, they could, matters could be arranged so that was a greater part of their responsibilities.
Yeah, well, and I think that's what Elisa also suggests, right? The grants would organize it in some way. Now, sometimes they do, and it depends a bit on the call. So some calls require that there's a study proposal that is detailed enough to actually be able to evaluate this. But there are also calls where people propose studies in more vague terms, and then it would not be able to review this. So I know of both kind of calls. So some are really detailed. You really submit the study proposal exactly as you would perform it. And others just describe, well, over the next 4 years, we'll do 12 studies using methods like this. And those are too vague to be reviewed. But there you could, require that they come back when they've worked it out, right? So I think if funders would take this, but in general, funders, when we talk about top-down kind of things, funders are even more conservative than the average university. They really feel like, no, this should not be our responsibility. If people feel this, okay. But funders start to do this if 80% of scientists say, yeah, we kind of expect this, right? I mean, they are very slow incorporating this. Some progressive funders might do it. Wellcome Trust might do it. Templeton Foundation, for example. Those are progressive funders. They might be interested, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. We have one comment in the chat, one question, whether in the Netherlands, the members of ethics committees are being paid or it's the faculty reserve time.
Yeah, there's no I don't know if it's the same everywhere, but I think so, because there's also NETHICS, a national ethics review board platform, and I'm pretty sure it's faculty time. So it's basically management tasks that people get in the department. Yeah, so none of these are paid. I think it would make sense to hire dedicated methodological reviewers. That's a different thing. I think it would make a lot of people more efficient, so money well spent, but currently I don't think that's done anywhere as far as I know.
All right. Daniel, thank you so much for bringing us into the El Dorado of what clinical research should be, or any research. And it's not easy. Very proud to see how you organized it at your university. It's really, really brilliant. And there's a lot to learn for many other organizations. But once again, I really think research funders should take this on board. And balancing this off with peer review process, which is daunting and really very difficult in many different ways, financially and people's time, resources, and its quality, definitely. So this sounds like a very excellent way forward. Now the question is, how can we implement it and how can we make systematic and a standard? And who knows, maybe science in 21st century will head in that direction. Maybe AI somehow will help it. Oh, by the way, that could be a next project, how you employ all these new chatbots to check the methodological quality
exactly.
of all the research plans. Yes.
Yeah, but if people want to try this out, I'm happy to share our experiences in more detail. So if you're thinking of trying it out, maybe for certain projects, by all means, let me know. And I'm happy to get you started if you're willing to give this a try.